Hi and welcome on behalf of Helbling to a series of teaching tips videos. I'm Herbert Puchter and with me in the studio is Chris Jory. Chris is an author, an expert in language teaching methodology and an excellent presenter, and it's my great pleasure to introduce him to you and to collaborate with him on these teaching tips videos.
Thank you, Herbert. It's a great pleasure to be working together with you on this.
We're very happy to be able to share with you a range of practical tips and insights in a series of 4 videos.
Yes, and in these videos we'll be looking at how to use songs, how to use video clips, how to help learners to learn to love grammar, and how to help them to learn better and to get better results.
Why are we making these videos available now? Well, a new syllabus will be introduced starting with year 1 in September 23. And we've been working hard for 2 years on creating support that you can count on and which will help you to implement the new syllabus successfully in your teaching.
So we'd like to invite you to watch this series of videos offering a taste of new ideas and new materials. Hello and welcome to the next video in our series of 4 teaching tip sessions from Helbling. And today I'll be talking through 6 points, 6 things you need to know that you might find useful when helping your learners to learn to love grammar, or at least sort of. I mean, is that even realistic for learners to learn to love grammar? When we think about the kind of typical common learner attitudes towards grammar, and I would count myself in this, many years ago when I was learning French at school, often the sentiments are not particularly positive, let's say. That's maybe typical English understatement. Have a look at the what's here on the screen. Have a look at these expressions of different attitudes that learners may have, and just have a think about how many of these you might recognize in your own learners. So firstly, quite typically, grammar is seen as something that is scary and to be afraid of. It's something that perhaps instills a fear of making mistakes. What will happen if I make a mistake? Will the world end? Also, while there may be a grudging acceptance that grammar is useful, or a real understanding that grammar is useful, that may be accompanied by a feeling that, yes, it's useful, but it's a necessary evil. It's really quite boring. I think a general awareness that if you, as a learner, study grammar hard and you practice it hard and regularly, then your English will improve. That is true. It's not a particularly positive or negative attitude. It's probably just a fact. Also, rules are a very prevalent concept when it comes to grammar, and that brings to mind images perhaps of having to learn a bit like a parrot and to memorize things rather than remember them, internalize them so that you can actually use them. Hopefully there's an understanding that by learning more grammar and learning to use it well, that is not just addressing ability to speak accurately, but also to be more fluent. And I'll come back to that in a bit more detail later. So that's definitely a positive. Hopefully there is that understanding among students. And then lastly, returning to a slightly more negative one, but with a promise of something better. This idea here in that last line that my anxiety about learning English as a learner could be eased if I was able to learn this scary grammar in a context that is fun and interesting and entertaining, because I guess these kinds of fears are often in the mind. And if you can distract your mind with fun and interest and engagement and entertainment, then you can learn and you can remember without having to memorize and be a slave to what you're trying to learn. Anyway, those attitudes, hopefully you recognize some of them, hopefully some of the positive ones in your learners, as well as maybe the slightly more scary or negative ones. And I think the first point here is it's really important for learners to overcome that fear factor. So, the grammar dragon, as I've termed it here, if the learners are seeing grammar as this scary monster that implies all sorts of negatives like, excessive control on what they are able to produce or learn, the fear of errors, it being a bit dull and a bit boring, even if it's useful, then that will bring lots of negative connotations. And it makes it much harder to have a positive learning and a positive teaching experience if the underlying initial attitude is not one of positivity, I guess. So I guess the question here is, how can we help learners to slay the grammar dragon? And maybe another question is that actually necessary? Is it a case of, well, it's actually not a case of killing grammar, because it is useful, you do need it. It's more a case of turning it into something that learners will enjoy and love. And I guess turning the scary dragon into a nice pet iguana that they can have, that is their friend. And how do we do that? How do we help learners to learn to love grammar? I'll show you examples in a minute, but I guess essentially it's about changing that mental attitude towards it so that it is actually a positive thing, and by creating more positive associations. So making grammar fun, making it communicative, making its communicative purpose very clear, making it playful, having activities that include surprising content, creativity, curiosity, all of these things can really change the face of grammar in a way that it is no longer that scary dragon, and it becomes that pet iguana that they want to spend time with. I think it's a bit like the England football team, actually, when you think about the fear factor. And typically, England can have quite good players sometimes, but when we go to a tournament, it feels like fear takes over, and the fear of making mistakes, and that football dragon in their case, I guess, inhibits performance. And if you compare that to Brazil and the joy that they display when, usually at least when they're playing, they're let off the leash, so to speak. And it's much easier then to really enjoy what you're doing and learn and perform better. So really that's the task here. How do we shift that mental attitude that learners may have, which may be a slightly ingrained, slightly negative attitude towards grammar, slightly grudging in terms of acknowledging its usefulness, a necessary evil. Make it something that they can enjoy, and then they will learn better. So let's look at some examples of how this can work. So here the title of this slide, make use of fun, but that doesn't mean frivolity. Fun is a slightly slippery word. It can sound a bit vacuous, and it can mean many things, and it's important to pin it down to what actually is underlying that. It's not about frivolous activity that will actually lead nowhere. It's about encapsulating various positive characteristics and associations. So instilling whether it's the texts that lead into the grammar, that present the grammar, or the activities themselves that include some element of feeling and emotion. It's about allowing learners to take ownership eventually of the language and have freedom in terms of how they use it. It's setting up the right kind of context for creativity, and maybe when their language level is high enough, playfulness with language, productively, as well as the playfulness that you can get from material receptively. Using it for communication, and also a really key word, and something that makes you sit up and take notice, whatever you're doing, is when there's an element of surprise. And on the screen here, there's a nice little activity. This is taken from Teaching Grammar Creatively, 2nd edition, from Herbert Puchta and Scott Thornbury. And this activity, it's practicing it's a nice little chunk. It takes X amount of time to do something. So it takes me 5 minutes to get from my home to my place of work, for example. And this activity takes what could be quite a boring structure if it's done in the wrong way, and gives it that wow factor of, the wow, I didn't know that factor. And the way this works is that you simply write these sentences on the board, or if you have higher level students, you could dictate them perhaps. So things like, it takes sunlight X minutes to reach the earth, it took the Greeks X number of years to conquer Troy, etc. So write these sentences on the board, and then you could ask students at that point to speculate, or if you want to give them more initial support, you dictate the numbers that are in fact the answers that go into those sentences. So you would dictate, in this case, 10, 20, 8, 30, etc. And then you allow them to work together to speculate on what the right answers are for the different sentences. And then you reveal the answers. And hopefully there is an element there of surprise and that, wow, I didn't know that element, which makes the sentence and therefore the target structure more memorable, because it's something they didn't know. The kind of little nugget of information that, again, going back to my own personal situation, often comes up around the dinner table, where people share things that they've learnt that day about the world, and they're just little curious facts, and they're things that stick in your mind. If they stick in your mind, the language associated with them in the lesson will also stick in the learner's mind. You could then ask them, if with a sufficiently competent class, you could ask them maybe to come up with their own example sentences of how long certain things take in the real world, and get them again to repeat the activity but with their own ideas. So it is a receptive task. There's also a productive element later on, but essentially receptive to start with. At the same time, it can still be meaningful and memorable. So that is an example of using something that is fun, but not fun in a kind of meaningless sense. It's fun in this case because it's surprising. Still on the same theme of fun, but not frivolity. Here we have a nice activity, and again, the key words here are not just fun, but the ones that I've highlighted there. So an element of feeling and freedom and creativity. And I'll just demonstrate how this works. So I'll do this with you as if you're my students. So firstly, if you can just close your eyes and relax. And I'm going to read you a text. And what I want you to do while you're listening, the text is describing an object. So it's a text that is describing an object. I just want you to think about what the object may be. Just try and imagine it as vividly as you can while you're listening. Okay, so here's this text for describing an object. Too many people write about love. I want to write about it's brown and smooth, a present from my dad. I've had it since I was 9, and I've always found it again when I've lost it. I sometimes smell it when I put it on, and it always reminds me of saddles and horses and Dad. Okay, you can open your eyes now. Obviously, I can't ask you what you thought the answer was. It is, in fact, a belt. It's a banal object. You could have had a text describing the belt. It's about 1 meter long. It's got 6 holes in it, and it's got a silver buckle. But you can use a much more powerful text to introduce the language that's required to describe an object, like in this case a belt, and instill it with those feelings, that emotion, and greater meaning, therefore. So maybe, have a think about how you were feeling when I was reading that text to you. What did it make you feel? Did it make you remember presents that you had received, for example? So if you do that in that way with students, hopefully it will surprise them initially, help them to sit up and take notice, because they may have been expecting a text that was just describing something literally. But this starts with too many people write about love. That's a very attention-grabbing first line. Nevertheless, the language that's in the text is still the language that is very central to what we're aiming to achieve here, which is allowing students to be able to describe an object. So you could ask them as a follow-up how it made them feel when they were listening to you reading that text. They can then read the text, they speculate on what the object is. As I said, it's a belt. You can then extend this, so the points there about freedom and creativity, you can then ask students to think of an object that they would like to describe, perhaps one that they've received as a present, and write their own text which describes it, but adding those highlights which add that kind of emotional quality. Then they can swap their texts, they can speculate together, read each other's text, speculate what the thing might be, and then they can share how they were feeling when they were reading the text from the other students. So this is just a nice example of how a text that is using quite simple language, where the target language is really quite simple, and it could be really dull and boring. It doesn't have to be. It can be fun in that more specific way. It's including emotion and then creativity as a second step. Moving on to the next point, going back to the grammar dragon and talking about it and looking at it not as a scary dragon, but as a friendly pet iguana. I think this is really key. The learners learn to understand grammar as being their friend, and there are also elements that may be within that sort of dragon-like perception of grammar that are obviously still useful and need to be part of the learning process. So, you know, students do need models, they need patterns, and to be able to notice patterns, they need rules, they need to focus on their accuracy, not just fluency, in order to become competent communicators. And they need drilling. Drilling is it may be quite traditional, depending on how it's done, but drilling is a really useful technique, and it's something that learners really benefit from. There are lots of benefits to drilling. It's really useful for noticing and remembering patterns and structures. It aids long-term retention of the target structures. It aids that long-term memory. It helps to really get learners to control the articulation of the target language. So a bit like when you're learning to drive a car or learning to ride a bike, you need to learn how to change the gears on the different handlebars to get up through the different gears, how to use the brakes. These things need to become relatively automatic and something that you can do without thinking too much, so that you can concentrate on the purpose of what you're doing, riding a bike. The same with language. You need to be able to have that controlled articulation of the language so that you can then think about what you want to say and think about different ways of saying it. So drilling is really helpful. It's like sitting on your bike at the top of the hill before you start cycling, and you're playing with the gears and checking you understand how it works and that you can move your hands in the right way and move your mouth in the right way to pronounce the words. Drilling also acts as a bit of it produces a safety net for learners, because it can help them to internalize chunks of language which become, I think in the words of Scott Thornbury, these islands of reliability that they can rest upon, I guess, in the context of longer utterances or longer exchanges. So if they know that there is this chunk of language that I know and I can just produce this chunk, it creates these stepping stones through interaction for them. And drilling is important in automizing those. It is really helpful, drilling, for fluency as well as for accuracy. Obviously, accuracy is a fundamental objective when drilling, but having those islands of reliability, those stepping stones that you can jump to as your next step, will also help with fluency. Drills themselves, a bit like that previous example with describing the belt, drills could be quite boring. They could be very one-dimensional. They don't have to be. You can have chants, for example, that inherently in the way they're put together with the language that they use, even quite basic language, can be playful. And then when you add to that the way that they're delivered in terms of the audio, the music, the video that can accompany the drill, it really lifts it into something that is almost not recognizable as a drill. It's something much more playful than the associations that students may have with drilling. And then obviously as a next step beyond the drilling stage, there are opportunities for personalization. So adapting the drills and then stepping outside of the drilling stage and actually giving learners that freedom to use the language that they've been gaining controlled articulation of through the drilling. So many, many benefits for drilling. There is, however, potentially that perception on the left, drilling is associated with loud pneumatic drills in the street or going to the dentist. Is it painful? Is it passive? Is it noisy? No, it doesn't have to be. That doesn't have to be the case. And I'd like to show you an example of how that can work. So we'll listen to a drill which is really for, again, it's beginners, it's very low level language, beginner level language. It's there is, there are, and a very limited amount of language. And just have a look and a listen to this drill and have a think about how your learners might react to this and how they would feel in the classroom if you were using this with them.
And now clap, clap, clap for a grammar rap. And today it's...
There is, there are
6 girls,
There are 6 girls
6 boys,
There are 6 boys
a football
There's a football
match.
There's a match
Goal!
There's a goal
For the grammar rap, you need to clap, clap, clap. But don't stop there, there's more to share.
There are 6 girls There are 6 boys There's a football There's a match There's a goal And that's all
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. The first time I saw it, I thought it was fantastic. And again, the point here is that with very little language, something really creative and engaging can be made, and that has obvious benefits in the classroom. It had benefits at home when I was first listening to it as well, where I was playing it. I found that I was tapping my feet, and when the rap stopped, I could hear a child in the next room actually repeating what they'd been listening to inadvertently. So it's very, very catchy, and it really makes you want to get up and move around the room, actually. It's fantastic. And then together with that, obviously you have material that is ready-made that comes with the rap that you use in the classroom with it. In this particular case, that example on the screen, you can see that there are actually language notes and instructions in the learner's first language to aid understanding at this kind of low level. But the real interest value is in the way that very basic language is used to create this really interesting and engaging grammar rap. So it's drilling, but it's drilling that is fun with a serious intent. And the great thing about these kinds of drills is that there's a huge amount of variety that can be brought to bear on them. So I'd like to take the opportunity just to play you the first few lines of each of these next 3. These are all for different grammatical structures, all relatively low level still, and just to give you a sense of the variety and how memorable the language can then become. So going back to that grammar dragon point early on that first slide, and students not necessarily feeling that positive about having to memorize rules, this kind of content can really help them to remember without having to memorize like an automated parrot, let's say. So let's listen to parts of these next 3 grammar raps.
For the grammar rap, you need to clap, clap, clap. But don't stop there, there's more to share.
I'm happy I'm not sad You're great You aren't bad He's hot He isn't cold She's young She isn't old It's fake It isn't
isn't true.
We're 10. We aren't 2.
You're active. You aren't lazy. They're clever. They aren't crazy.
I don't like milk. You don't like steak. He doesn't like crisps. She doesn't like cake. It doesn't like bread.
We don't like meat.
They don't like chili.
Give us a treat.
I was born in China. You were born in Spain. He was born in Austria.
And we are all the same. She was born in Brazil. We were born in France. They were born in Italy. And they love to dance.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed those, and perhaps you were tapping your feet there, wherever you are, at home or at work. Moving on from fun grammar apps and chants and playful drilling into another key point. This is the 5th point in the session in terms of how to help your learners to learn to love grammar. There's this journey that we all go on when we're learning anything, where to start with, you're really just forming an initial awareness of what it is that you need to learn and how things work. You're having the opportunity to engage in some really quite controlled, safe practice. And you go through these initial stages until you build up confidence. And really where you're aiming for is a point where you can take ownership of this thing that you're learning. So in this case, we're talking about the English language, obviously, where you can own it, you internalize it, it becomes yours to be creative with, and you can use it potentially even playfully. I mean, people do say that, you know, if you can make jokes in the language that you're learning, then you're really quite, you've achieved quite a good level. And I think that's true, obviously, in terms of that creativity and the playfulness. But it is a journey, and you have to take this journey in stages. So controlled practice, characteristics of that are that it tends to be quite safe. It tends to be regulated not by the learner, but by some kind of external either person or other element. So most frequently, I guess it would be the teacher in the classroom carefully guiding the learners through that stage. It could be through cyber homework that what they're given online to do is actually helping to perform that function as well, in terms of feeding them the right kind of dosage of what they need when they need it. But the point here is that it's relatively controlled, it's safe, it builds confidence, and it allows the learners to take that next step towards that destination, which is acquiring that ownership where they're being more creative and freer in how they use the language, and then they're ready for more self-regulated use. They don't need that control, and actually that control would be unhelpful because it would be a constraint on their freer and more personalized use of the language. So this is a well-known journey that is in terms of language teaching, but also in other things that we learn in life. So it's analogous really to how you learn to ride a bike. I guess most of you probably know how to ride a bike. Maybe you ride bikes quite frequently. I remember quite vividly how I learned to ride a bike when I was a kid. I started on a tricycle, usually dressed in a cowboy outfit. I was only about 4 or 5 years old at the time. Then you progress through that stage where you have stabilizers on the back wheels. Then perhaps a helpful parent or maybe an older brother will hold the saddle behind you as you take your first steps on just 2 wheels. And then in my case, I remember the first time I rode on a bike without stabilizers and with only 2 wheels. When I really rode on it on my own, I thought someone was still behind me because my mum was holding the saddle and was walking along behind. And as I started going more quickly, she took her hands away, but I didn't know that. And I was actually cycling without realizing it. I thought I still had that safety, but it gave me the confidence to be able to do it. Obviously, this is a process. Any learning process, you're going to make mistakes. And the pain of falling off the bike and grazing your knee is actually something that should be quite joyful in a way, because it's how you learn. And that's a really key point in this process, whether it's language learning, whether it's riding a bike. With the kids at home, when they fall over and bloody their knees, secretly I'm quite happy actually, because it means they're learning. And although it's slightly painful at the time, it's something that they're going to learn from, and it will increase their confidence and help them to get to where they want to get to. And then obviously with the bike analogy, you then are able to cycle on your own and perhaps become playful and creative. So I remember when I was a kid with my brother, we used to ride around on bikes that had no brakes, and we would put wooden ramps in the street and try and do wheelies. It was in the days when Evel Knievel was coming to London and jumping on a motorbike over double-decker buses. We wanted to imitate that. We wanted to recreate that ourselves. And obviously we fell off, but we'd taken ownership at that point of that ability to ride a bike, to fall off, and it not to matter. And this is that 0.5 here in a nutshell, really. Making language your own by going through that journey, that carefully staged journey, making those mistakes. It can be painful, but you get to that ownership at the end. And that can manifest itself looking at relatively low levels as well, in even beginner level, in quite simple ways. So there's a nice example here on the screen, material that you can use in the classroom. And this lesson is for verbs in the simple past. There's a nice controlled practice activity at the beginning where the learners are matching verbs to the pictures. They then have a little gap fill. They've got a grammar table to support them. But then they are allowed the opportunity to actually ask each other questions and answer. So there's that personalized, freer element. And that really, in microcosm, is that journey of learning how to ride a bike. And you have that control and that safety, and then you're allowed the opportunity to actually be let off the leash and do your own thing, but with that element of safety around you still. And going back to drilling is quite relevant to this, because that sort of automatic articulation and control of the language is important in terms of confidence and actually intelligible delivery of the language. And it's a bit like those islands of reliability, like stepping stones through through discourse. And going back to the question of safety versus freedom, little anecdote, I was in Scotland this summer, and there's a lot of water in Scotland. There are lochs and streams and the sea and everything. And we spent quite a lot of time out walking, and we spent a lot of time stepping over stepping stones to get across bits of water. And I'm not the most well-balanced person in the world, physically I mean. Quite readily fall over, given half a chance. And I found I was getting my feet wet occasionally by missing the stepping stones or just slipping or whatever. And then we were at the beach on, I think, the penultimate day that we were there. And the tide had gone out, and there were lots of rocks and stones strewn across the beach still. And I started walking across the stepping stones with no water underneath. And I found, strangely, that I was able to do it much better because there was no concern that I might slip and wet my feet. And I realized then that actually I could do it much better than I had been doing it when there was water. So I tried it again somewhere else the next day where there was water, and I found I could do it better. So I think that encapsulates the importance of that initial stage where there is controlled practice regulated by someone else, so you gain that confidence as a learner, and then when you do have the freedom, you have the confidence to do better. Okay, moving on. Point 6, the last point for today in terms of helping your learners to love grammar, is really helping them understand that grammar is not for the sake of grammar. You're not dealing with the grammar dragon, or the dragon iguana, hopefully, for the sake of the grammar dragon. It's for you, and it's for your ultimate goal, which is to communicate in English. And really, a key thing here is that communication needs to be invested with meaning. It can't just be communication for the sake of it. In the same way that grammar is not for the sake of grammar, communication is not just for the sake of articulating language. There has to be some underlying meaning and genuine intent there. And we'll look in a moment at an example of a very simple activity and how this can bring that genuine meaning to a very simple activity in the classroom. But before we look at that, I'd just like you to think about the last time that anyone gave you a present. And just think about who gave it to you, what was it, and more importantly, how did it make you feel? And an example from me, this is just from, I think, 3 days ago. Where I live in just the northwest tip of Tuscany in a little old house there that I bought about 20 years ago and moved there a couple of years ago from England. And the old guy that had it before me, when I bought it from him, he was already about 82 years old, and we became friends, and we used to spend quite a lot of time together on the land outside and also in the cellar underneath the house that he still had. And I've got really good memories of being down there with him, chatting about all sorts of things, about the local area, about the history of the place, about what he did in the 1940s, all sorts of things. We used to sit down there and drink the wine that he used to make from the vines that are in the fields all around, that area. And he passed away a few years ago in his late 90s, but I still have those very good memories of him. And just 2 or 3 days ago, his son happened to come up to the village, and we were chatting, and he's in his 70s now, this guy's son, and he took me into the cellar that the old guy had, and there was a bottle in there just resting on an old dusty bench, and he picked it up and he said, would you like this? And I took the bottle, this dusty old bottle. It had a label on, by appointment to Her Majesty the Queen, and it was a bottle of whiskey, half drunk, that had been there for 50 years in this old guy's cellar. And his son gave it to me and said, would you like to keep that? And I don't drink whiskey, but I took it gladly because it had some kind of emotional significance for me, and it's now on a nice shelf on the landing at home. And it's something I'll never drink, but I'll keep it because it means something to me. And this activity here on the page, there are the controlled stages initially. This is object pronouns. The thing I want to focus on is the last activity there, which is where the students, once they've had a bit of controlled practice, they are then prompted in the classroom to choose other students in the class, other learners in the class that they want to give presents to. They have to draw or write the present on a piece of paper, and then they take it and they give that piece of paper to one of the other kids in the class. And they have a conversation about it. They say, this is for you, and the other one replies, oh, this is for me, or this is for us. And they're using the target language, but they're using it in a way and in a context that, even though these are pieces of paper, they're not real presents. You know the saying, it's the thought that counts. It is the thought that counts when it gives a present. And although they're only giving pieces of paper, they really are, in a sense, giving real presents to each other. And that would invest the activity, a very simple activity with a very simple language point, with that emotional significance that students will probably remember. They will probably remember that this other kid, whatever their name is, gave me this present, and I know how I felt, and I remember how I felt, and therefore I remember the language that I used when I received it. So just a very simple example of how this kind of meaning can be instilled in very simple activities. Okay, so maybe just returning to those attitudes that we looked at the beginning of the session, where many of them were quite negative. There were a couple of positives, a neutral one, but often they were relatively negative. And I would suggest that, if we implement the kind of things I've been talking about in the session today, then even at very low levels, we can help to make those attitudes more positive. So you could replace them with the kind of thing that we have on the screen here now. So an understanding that mistakes are actually really positive, that when you fall off the bike and graze your knee, that's great. It's great to have blood on your knee because you've learned something. That grammar can actually be interesting. It can be invested with real meaning. It can be invested with that surprise element, the wow, I didn't know that factor, those nuggets of information and surprising facts. Thirdly, it's important that we carefully take learners through those initial controlled practice stages, raising their awareness initially, but then they need that freedom. They need to be allowed to make the language their own. Fourthly, learners don't necessarily need to memorize grammar rules. They can remember grammar if the activities lend themselves to memory, and it doesn't have to be parrot fashion. Learning grammar is for communication. It will make learners more fluent, that's true. And that is a really key step in that process, giving them that freedom, letting them use it. And then the last point, we all want to learn everything that we learn through enjoyable activity, I guess. It does ease our anxiety. It means that we will enjoy learning more. So grammar is not special in that respect. Just to recap on the 6 things that I've talked through today, the fear factor. It's really important that learners lose their fear of grammar. It's important that they learn, if not to love it, at least to like it and to want to spend time with it. You can do that by showing them or helping them to understand that there are positive associations that can be part of grammar in their language learning, things like playfulness and surprise, creativity. Thirdly, use fun in its various forms, emotion, creativity, surprise, all of these things, but it's not fun for the sake of fun. It's fun with a serious learning intent. It's not grammar for the sake of grammar. It's grammar for communication. Fourthly, the grammar dragon, it is helpful. It is their friend as well. You do need rules, you need patterns, you need drilling, you need controlled practice, you need accuracy. Fifthly, help them to make the language their own by giving them the opportunity to use it when they're ready. Let them try riding on the bike, maybe take your hands away before they realize, let them fall over, they'll learn. And then lastly, that point about meaningful communication, the example about the activity, giving each other presents, that will be memorable, it will really mean something to them. I hope you found today's session both useful and interesting. If you'd like to download any of the material from the session, there's a link on the screen now. Thank you very much for watching and for listening, and see you again soon.